Here's the good news. The book of Proverbs are like cheat notes to the jigsaw puzzle of life. You got that? They're like cheat notes to the jigsaw puzzle of life. And they're especially addressed to young, naive people who are starting out in life. Do you remember when you were 18 or 20 and you're trying to make sense of life? It all begins with this. You're sort of 18, 20, you're moving out of home, and it's my life. What am I going to do with my life? And one of the first questions that comes to mind is money. How significant is money? How much money do I want? It's always a significant question, isn't it? As we set out, money seems to be all important. But that then plays into work. What am I going to do for work? How important is work? And is work actually the secret to happiness? You know, if I have the perfect career, is that what's going to make me happy? And so we put these pieces together, but very quickly as we think about work, we realize that leisure is also pretty important to us. And the problem is good, high-paying jobs usually require lots of time and lots of responsibility that interferes with leisure. So do I really want a high-paying job, or do I just want to work at Subway till I'm 37 living at home with my parents so that I have lots of leisure? You know how many kids are answering that question these days. But then when you're a young adult, there's another thing that automatically comes to mind as well, very quickly. Sex. And if I'm living at home with my parents till I'm 37 and don't have a good job, what are my prospects on that one? Again, how do I put these pieces together? And as you think about sex, how does that relate to marriage and love? These days we separate all three and go, well, they've got nothing really to do with each other. But does life actually work well when you separate these three things? Not enough thought is given to this. And of course, you're moving out of home. These sort of things are happening. You mix alcohol into the equation at somewhere around 18 and 20 years of age. And because sex drive and everything else is going on, you often also end up with children, often not when you're ready for it. Again, trying to put the pieces together. You move out of home and suddenly your sphere of friends, and I use friends, usually becomes bigger because you're at university or in the workplace. So what does it mean to be a friend? What is a real friend like in life? And of course, because you're now a young adult, we consider you responsible. So we offer you this wonderful thing called debt. Would you like 1, 2, or 10 credit cards? Oh, free money, give me 10 credit cards. And all of a sudden you think, what mistakes could we possibly make with these jigsaw puzzles of life? It's a bit scary, isn't it? Where's the instruction manual? How do we get taught to put the pieces together? The book of Proverbs actually starts to offer wisdom and guidance on how important each one of these puzzle pieces is and how they fit together with one another so that life actually works. As I begin today, my first point is this. Wisdom for a good life happens under God's good justice system. Okay? So wisdom for a good life, and you can have a good life because God has a good justice system. I want you to look with me reading from verse 1. We'll unpack this a little bit more today. Chapter 1, verse 1. Let's begin by reading. It says, "The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behaviour, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance." The first 7 verses are like a prologue to this book. The first 7 verses tell us the purpose of the book. The purpose is to give wisdom, especially to young, naive people starting life, but also to older people. You can get more wisdom, can't you? You can get wiser. So it's to young people, but also to older people so that they can grow in wisdom. But having told us the purpose, we're actually told the motto of this book, or the premise of this book in verse 7. Just look at verse 7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. This is the key idea of the book. When you begin life and you start thinking, what makes a good life? How do I have a good life? Proverbs is saying, don't forget God. The only way to have a good life is to actually have God in the equation. When you look back at the puzzle pieces, it's not actually my life in isolation. Your life, whether you like it or not, always exists in a relationship with God. It might be a good relationship, it might be a bad relationship, but your life always exists in some sort of relationship to God. And so, first bit of advice, remember God. Don't forget God. Now, you can see in verse 1 that it says the Proverbs of who? Solomon. Now, some of you may not know the story, but just before Solomon became king, God turned up and said, I'll grant you one wish. Ask me whatever you want and I'll give it to you. Now, you think a young man, what's he going to ask for? Power or money or fame? But in his humility, Solomon said, Lord, I need your wisdom to govern your people. And God was so impressed with his answer, his reply, that God poured out more wisdom upon him than anyone else in the Bible apart from the Lord Jesus. So we're dealing with like the most wise person in the Bible apart from Jesus. This man actually has runs on the board. People used to travel from Egypt and all around the world just to hear Solomon's wisdom. It's worth listening to, perhaps, isn't it? Worth listening to. Now, in its original context, Solomon probably wrote Proverbs to give young men coming up through the royal courts into positions of power wisdom. Now, Solomon didn't want to employ fools and put them in significant positions. So he's given this, and people rising up through the kingdom of Israel would have been expected to learn this to get significant positions. But you'll notice that Solomon writes it from the perspective of a mum and dad, because he doesn't just want this to be taught in the royal courts, he wants it to be taught in every home in Israel. The context of this is family devotions. Wise mum and dad imparting Solomon's wisdom to their children. Now, that's what's going on. And as we jump into this, there's some really important words in the prologue that we need to understand. So there's words here in the beginning. They're going to come up throughout the book. The first word is wisdom. And in Proverbs, it's more or less used interchangeably with understanding, okay? So wisdom and understanding, they kind of used the same. And what it actually means is knowing how life works in this world. Knowing how life works in this world. Just flick over with me to Proverbs 4 verse 7 for a minute. Proverbs chapter 4 verse 7. We're going to come back to one in a minute, but just look at chapter 4 verse 7. Everyone got it? Chapter 4 verse 7. The beginning of wisdom is this. Get wisdom. First step to becoming wise, decide that you need to become wise. Okay, but look at how it goes on. Though it cost all you have, get understanding. What you see in this verse is that wisdom and understanding are synonyms. They're not two separate things, they're actually the same thing, and at all costs you want to get them. And what Proverbs is saying, this is actually a nuclear bomb in a postmodern world where all truth is supposedly equal. Proverbs is saying, sure, you can live life however you like if you want, but there is a way that life works and there is a way that life doesn't work. The wise person chooses the way that life works. The fool does life in a way that it doesn't work. Wisdom, I'll give you a fuller definition in a moment, a more complex definition, but wisdom is understanding and knowing how life works. Now, this is related to another word, an old-fashioned word that we don't use anymore. It's prudence. Prudence is using wisdom to navigate life in a way that works positively. It's only used 15 times in Proverbs, but it is wisdom applied. Let me say prudence is the opposite of being impetuous What's the other word? I can't remember the other word. What's the other word for the opposite of prudence? There was another word I was thinking of, I've forgotten it. Wayward. Impulsive, all those sort of words. Now, you may like to think, if you're impulsive, if you're impetuous, you don't think about the consequence of your actions. You just go, oh, I'm going to do this, and run off, and you don't think about what's going to happen. Once you start to get wisdom, you realize, if I take this action, that's going to happen, but if I take this action, that's going to happen, and what's the wiser thing for me to do? So if you tend to be impetuous, this is a book for you. Wisdom applied makes you more prudent, thoughtful in the decisions you make. That also then leads to another form of application, which is discipline. Discipline, keeps coming up a fair few times, means forming wise habits to avoid negative consequences or corporal punishment. You can establish habits in your life that always end badly. Or you can establish habits in your life that almost always end well. I'll give you an example of a discipline that all your mums and dads taught you, I hope. Brush your teeth every night. What's the bad consequence if you don't form that habit? Dental bills, holes, extractions, dentures, it keeps going. Well, wisdom is saying there's all sorts of disciplines in life that you have to establish, not just brushing your teeth each night, but other sorts of disciplines if you want to avoid negative consequences. And so wisdom applied to our life first helps us to be prudent in the decisions we make, but then it helps us to form wise habits so that life starts to work better. With that said, let me give you a really technical definition of wisdom. The definition I'm about to give to you is complex, but it has a really key idea in the middle that we're going to have to get our head around in Proverbs, okay? This definition comes from a guy called Bruce Waltke, who is kind of considered the evangelical expert on the book of Proverbs, okay? He's about as good as you can get. This is what he says about wisdom, and you're going to have to think this one through. In Proverbs, wisdom mostly denotes mastery over life experience, becoming master of what's going on in your life, through the intellectual, emotional, and spiritual state of knowing existentially the deed-destiny nexus. So, knowing in every part of your life, in how you live, the deed-destiny nexus. I'll say something about that in a moment. Thereby enabling its possessor to cope with enigma and adversity when it happens, to actually break down strongholds, recognize when things are false and untrue, and so promote the successful life of an individual and/or a community. Now that sounds really heavy, but it's an awesome definition, and I want you to zoom in on those words. Deed, destiny, nexus. It's a really key idea to the book of Proverbs. The deed-destiny nexus is like Isaac Newton's third law of motion. Can you all go back to school with me a minute? Isaac Newton said the third law of motion is that every action has an equal and opposite. You all passed physics. Well done. Proverbs is actually saying the same thing. Proverbs is saying that every action that you make in this world has a reaction, either good or bad, because you're living under God's justice system that is written into the very fabric of creation. You following me? So every action you take in life has a reaction that can either be good or bad. And as you understand what actions are going to result in what reactions, you become wise in choosing which way you go. You with me? Now, at one level, this means wisdom in Proverbs is a little bit like Hindu karma. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. You've all heard that before? Proverbs is a little bit more complex though. Proverbs understands that it's not just mechanical. God is always in involved in the process of deed and destiny. And because God is always involved in the process, there's sometimes a measure of mystery to the deed and the destiny. You know there's going to be an act, you do something, you know there's going to be a result, but sometimes I can't fully foresee the result because sometimes God uses justice and sometimes God is gracious and shows me mercy. And so sometimes the destiny doesn't quite line up with the deed, but nonetheless, in God's order of things, our deeds result in certain destinies, although Proverbs also acknowledges the time frame can often be quite delayed. You may do the deed now, the destiny may be 7 years down the track, or it may not even happen until the final judgment day when the destiny works out for the deeds that you have done. You following me? But there is a deed-destiny nexus that Proverbs is working on, that as we go through life, our actions have certain consequences, and when you recognize the consequences of the actions, you can make better choices in the actions that you take. That's why verse 7 talks about the fear of the Lord. We often think the fear of the Lord is just respect for God or reverence for God, but in this context of Proverbs, fear of the Lord is recognizing that God is king and his justice is always applied at some point. So if you don't actually follow his justice system, what happens? You get in trouble, don't you? So the fear of the Lord in this context is a healthy respect for God being king and his justice always prevailing. Look with me at verse 3. Look at the end of verse 3 for a moment. Chapter 1, verse 3. You'll see 3 words. What are we being instructed to do? What is right and just and fair. They're the scales of justice, aren't they? There's the scales of justice. God is a God who actually establishes justice. So listen to this. When you're doing something that is not right, God tends to balance the scales to make it right again. If you're being unjust, God in his system tends to make things just again. And if you're being unfair, God tends to be a God who makes things fair. This is God's justice. And what you want to make sure is that you're always on the right side of the equation when God reestablishes his justice. You don't want to be on the wrong side of that equation, do you? And the reality is, you live in a world where God is just, and a good life comes from recognizing that God is king and his justice will always prevail in one way or another. The only alternative is actually death and destruction. You see, wisdom recognizes that a bad life is also a result of God's good justice system. Wisdom recognizes that a bad life is also a result of God's good justice system. Have a look with me at verse 8, reading from verse 8. Everyone got it? Verse 8. Listen, my son, to your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. They are a garland to grace your head and a chain to adorn your neck. My son, if sinful men entice you, do not give in to them. If they say, come along with us, let's lie in wait for innocent blood, let's ambush some harmless soul, let's swallow them alive like the grave. They're not good words, are they? The first bit of wisdom that mum and dad give to their son is this: don't join a gang. That's how simple it is. Mum and dad are saying to their son, don't join a gang. Now you might think that good children growing up in a Christian Judeo house shouldn't need to be told, don't join a gang. Have you watched the news lately of what's going on in Melbourne? There's gangs going wild in Melbourne of young youth at the moment who have not been instructed wisely by their parents as they are growing up. And they are making all sorts of tragic choices that seem right in their eyes, but we all know are absolutely stupid choices to be making at 17 and 18 years of age. Proverbs reminds us that sin has so damaged this world that you can make some really bad choices, can't you, in life? Proverbs reminds us that nothing should be taken for granted. You might think, I shouldn't need to tell my child, don't join a gang. But guess what? Maybe you do need to tell your child, don't join a gang. Guys, you know it's been medically proven now that the adult brain, especially in boys, doesn't fully develop with the deed destiny, the deed consequence joiner till mid-20s, late 20s even, they say. The whole deed destiny, young men can't see that if I do this, I'm sure if I jump off the building I can fly. They don't get it. And so Proverbs is actually teaching us that we need to educate our young people to see the consequence of their choices and their actions. I only have to think back to when I was 19 or 20. I'm not even going to look at my parents at the moment. I was so dumb, so stupid. It's a miracle I'm alive today. I tell you what. You too, but yeah. But this dad is a good dad. This is a dad who actually gives wisdom, takes time to educate his son. Look with me at verse 15. Just look at verse 15, what dad says to his son. He's very clear. He's very direct. Verse 15, my son, do not go along with them. Do not set foot on their paths, for their feet rush into evil. They are swift to shed blood. How useless to spread a net where every bird can see it. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Son, don't do it. I can see what you want to do. I was a young man once too. I wanted to do those sort of stupid things. Don't do it. He's incredibly clear, and he says, this is an important word, he says the path of the gang is not the path of wisdom. That word path is going to come up in Proverbs over and over again. What path are you on in life? Remember Jesus' words? Broad is the path that leads to destruction, and narrow is the path that leads to life. Do you know where he gets that concept from? Straight out of Proverbs. Proverbs keeps teaching over and over again. Broad is the path that leads to destruction. Narrow is the path that leads to life. And what path are you on, my son? And what he helps his son to see is the deed destiny nexus. He says to his son, who sets a trap for the birds in full view of the birds? No one does that, do they? Because if you set a trap for the birds in full view of the birds, they see the trap and they don't get caught. And what Solomon is saying, at the moment you're looking at the gang and you can't see the trap that is going to get you. All you can see is the bait. All you see is the plunder, the wealth, the sharing a common purse, being someone in the peer group, but you don't see the trap. And have a look with me at what the trap is. Look at verse 19 or verse 18. Verse 18, he tells him the consequence. These men lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush only themselves. There's the consequence. Now that consequence may not be immediately apparent, but when God applies his justice system and rebalances the scales, what happens? You know what God's justice says? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, wrong for wrong. So if you've taken life, what happens when God's justice is applied? You've taken your own life. If you've stolen from someone and God's justice is applied, what happens? You lose and pay back what's taken. He says, look, this is the consequence. If you do this, you will waylay, you will destroy, you will take your own life in one way or another. Look at verse 19. Verse 19, such are the paths of all who go after ill-gotten gain. It doesn't say such is the path of some who go after ill-gotten gain. It doesn't say sometimes that's the case. It says this is the path of all who go after ill-gotten gain. At some point, justice catches up with them and they actually take their own life and they do damage and hurt to themselves. Do you see that? It's not good. Now, the application here For all the younger people in the church who, well, let's say the application for all the juvenile delinquents is don't join a gang. There's not that many young people in the church today, is there? So here's the application for all of you older delinquents who would never do something as stupid as join a gang. Don't try to profit from dishonest gain. There's the application. You see, the young men may be stupid enough to try and do it through a gang, but older men who think they know the ways of the world still try to profit, don't we, from ill-gotten gain by selling dodgy goods or lying or manipulating a situation. And this is saying don't do it, because at some point God's justice will catch up with you. Ill-gotten gain is not the way to actually acquire wealth. And you will end up shooting yourself in the foot one way or another. Sometimes it might be your right foot with a thong on. Other times it may be your left foot with steel-cap boots on. But you're still shooting yourself in the foot. It's going to hurt a little bit at least. Don't go after ill-gotten gain. Now, Proverbs, Solomon is going to have a lot to say about acquiring wealth. He says, if you want to earn money and do a job, work hard, save well, be disciplined, be a good steward, make wise investments, and money will work for you. But don't go the short route of ill-gotten gain, because it will always hurt you. How much do our young people need to hear that? We're looking for the short, easy option all the time. But the right option is hard work, wisdom, discipline, and you can acquire wealth. Now, friends, before I move on, there's an application here that I just want to point out to you as well that keeps coming up in Proverbs. You'll notice from this application of a gang that most of the wisdom in Proverbs is directed to young men, and the applications apply to young men more than they do to women. Now, you'll just notice this as we work through, and you might go, well, that's a bit sexist, isn't it? Let me just remind you that Solomon also wrote the book Song of Songs, which is addressed to the daughters of Jerusalem, and all the applications are more feminine. Okay, so there is a book for the goose and the gander from Solomon. But here's the thing I want you to notice in Proverbs. Although it's directed to men, and although the applications are more man-centric, did you notice what the father said to the son about the mother? What did the father tell the son about the mother? Do not reject your mother's teaching. Exactly right. The wise father tells the son to listen to their mother, because Jewish women who have grown up under Jewish wisdom can also be a source of wisdom. It's not just the men who have got the wisdom, it's the women who have got the wisdom as well. And the wise father tells his son, don't write your mother off. Respect her as a woman, listen to her, because she's a source of wisdom. Now that's how Proverbs begins. Guess how Proverbs ends? Chapter 31 says, if you're a married man and you have a godly wife who is more precious than rubies, what should you do? Respect her and listen to her as well. And then, guess what? Wisdom itself throughout the book of Proverbs is personified as a beautiful woman. The wisdom that all of us are meant to respect and listen to is personified as a beautiful woman. Now, I don't want to psychologize Proverbs, but in a book that is directed to young men and all the applications are to young men, guess what they're constantly being told? Respect women, listen to women, they've got something valuable to contribute in the whole walk of life and how you do life well. Again, isn't that something that young men actually need to hear a lot of the time? Chauvinism is a problem. We've struggled with it for years. The idea. Wisdom touches all of life for men and women, and as we live under God, we can actually pass on wisdom as men and women to those around us. Friends, my final point today then is this. You need to make a choice in life. Fear God or fear harm. There's your choice. Choice in life, fear God or fear the consequences. Let me just have a look with you. We're going to read from verse 20. Read from verse 20 as we get on to our last point. Out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. On top of the wall, she cries out. At the city gate, she makes her speech. How long will you who are simple love your simple ways? How long will mockers delight in mockery and fools hate knowledge? Repent at my rebuke, then I will pour out my thoughts to you. I will make known to you my teachings. Here is Lady Wisdom presented for her first time, but not the last time. Lady Wisdom will keep turning up in this book, and sadly, like many wives have to do with their husbands, she's pleading, listen to me, respect me, I've got something valuable to contribute. And she pleads and she says, look, if you listen to me, you'll understand how to do life well. If you reject me, life is not going to go well. And Proverbs chapter 3 will explain, 2 weeks' time, Proverbs chapter 3 will explain the reason we need to listen to wisdom is that God used Lady Wisdom when he laid the foundations of the world and when he set the heavens in place. Let me explain this. God actually used wisdom when he made the hardware of this world. He made the hardware of this world to run on the software of wisdom and justice. Does that make sense? So the actual product that we're working with, our lives, our world, everything has been made to run with a particular software. And when we reject the software of wisdom, we reject the software of God's justice, it's like trying to run Publisher, Microsoft Publisher on a Mac, or run Mac Pages on Microsoft PC. It doesn't work, does it? They're trying to make them integrate, but they still don't really work. And this is saying because God has made the world to run on a certain software, when you try and run life on a different software, it's never going to work properly. And so the right way to live is to listen to God's wisdom. Now there's 3 negative responses that you can make, and we saw them in verse 22. Again, 3 responses that we're going to see in Proverbs over and over again. You can be a simpleton, ignore. You can be a mocker, or you can be a fool with what I'm telling you. You see the 3 responses in verse 22? Let me just unpack these because these are going to come up again and again as well. The simple person is the ignorant, unthinking, maybe even naive young person. They're not wise because they don't understand life. But the good thing about a simple person is they are still redeemable. If they actually stop and start listening to wisdom, they can grow up and they can become wise. But here's a simple person. They have no roadmap. They do not understand the road rules, and they just go through life with lots of insurance claims and a pretty battered up car. That's simple, okay? The mocker is one step further along the path. The mocker is actually a proud, self-reliant worldview person who's kind of pushing back. I don't need God. I've got a proud, I know how life works. I don't need anything else. And you can see Proverbs 21:24 says, the proud and arrogant man, mocker is his name. He behaves with overweening pride. Now, as pride builds up and we think we know how life works, we start to become unteachable. We stop listening to other people. We stop listening to women because I know better than women, and we stop listening to other people, and pride actually starts making us unteachable. And so we mock other people. This is one step further along. You're actually in danger when you become a mocker to not actually growing in wisdom, but it's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is when you become a fool. A fool, according to various parts of the Bible, is a person who rejects the existence of God and rejects God's justice system. See, when you reject God altogether and you reject that there is a justice system, you're actually in serious danger at that point. It's almost impossible for you to become wise because you reject the source of wisdom. And Proverbs 26:11 says, as a dog returns to its vomit, so a fool repeats his folly. You'd hope you'd only do that once, wouldn't you? But that's the very essence of a fool. A fool keeps doing the same stupid things over and over and over again, and yet expects better results. That's the definition of lunacy, isn't it? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And yet the fool, while denying God and denying God's justice, fails to see that all the bad problems in his life are actually a form of God's justice, trying to wake him up and call him back to the truth. How foolish, how sad it is to be in that state. But let me say, wherever you are on that journey at the moment of trying to put the jigsaw puzzle of life together, it's not too late to start listening to God's wisdom. If you have a pulse, if there's breath in your lungs, it's not too late to start listening. The right way to live in this world is with God's wisdom. And while Solomon was very wise, when Jesus came to earth, speaking about himself, he said, "One wiser than Solomon is now here." Solomon spoke about God's wisdom written into creation, but Jesus embodied God's wisdom, God's justice, in the whole way that he did life. He was God's wisdom incarnate. And so real wisdom comes from him. The reason Jesus came into this world is this: God's justice is going to catch up with you at some point. Let me say that. That's the reason Jesus came. At some point, because God is just, his justice has to catch up with you. And if you've done the wrong thing, you've made foolish choices, that's actually bad news. But I'll tell you the good news. Jesus came to earth as a human being to break the deed-destiny nexus that was holding our lives. Our foolish deeds had determined that our destiny was now death and hell, no option. That was the destiny we were all facing. But Jesus came and he accepted responsibility for our deeds. He said, all the wrong they've done, I'll accept responsibility for. And what is the destiny for all they've done wrong? Oh, it's death and it's forsakenness by you, God, and it's hell. I'll take all that so that they can be spared. Isn't that awesome? And so Jesus actually broke the deed-destiny nexus that was taking us to hell so that we could be forgiven and we could be pardoned and we could have a new life. And when you trust in Jesus dying for you and you begin listening to Jesus as your source of wisdom, you begin to actually live the life that God originally intended you to live, right? You're forgiven, you start listening to wisdom, applying wisdom, you start to live the life that God intended you to live, which is the only way you can live a good life. The best way to live in this world is still to live your life in accordance with God's wisdom. So what are you going to do? What choice will you make when it comes to God's wisdom? You can do life without God's wisdom. Plenty of people do it. But is it a good life? Is it a life that works? Look with me at the final two verses in 32 and 33. The waywardness of the simple will kill them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will live in safety and be at ease without fear of harm. Can you see there's two ways to live? There's a foolish way and there's a wise way. And here's the choice. There's two things that you can fear in life. Up on the screen. You can fear the Lord and then you live without fear of harm. Or you do not fear the Lord and you always live with fear of harm. Do you notice? These verses, the fear of the Lord and fear of harm, come up in the final voices. What choice will you actually make with your life? Are today a day that you could take yourself off the pedestal and say, Lord, I actually need your wisdom. Lord, I need to come to Jesus. This is a wonderful book. And friends, it's going to require some hard work to understand some of the concepts in this, like deed, destiny, and how that really works. And some of you may need to memorize memorize some of these proverbs, and actually write them upon your heart. Are you willing to do that? Remember, what was the first step in wisdom? Get wisdom. First step in wisdom, get wisdom. Are you willing to do the hard work? I want to tell you something so many of us leave this on the shelf gathering dust. We don't spend time meditating on it or thinking about it, but this is what Proverbs says to us. What God is offering us in this book is more precious than rubies, more profitable than silver, and yields a better return than gold. That's something worth investing in, isn't it? I ask you to come on the journey with me as we invest in God's wisdom from Proverbs. Let me pray. Let me pray. Dear Lord God, you know us all too well. You know that we so easily in life go after the bling rather than the substance. Lord, help us to see the rubies, the silver and gold are nothing, nothing, nothing compared to the wisdom you are offering us on how to do life, how to do relationships, how to make wise choices so that we don't hurt ourselves or others. Lord, we pray and ask that you will truly give us the discipline, the desire to get wisdom from you so that we may live lives that are truly pleasing to you and satisfying to ourselves. Lord, we pray and ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.